I promised a full tutorial on what I feel is the best custom Game Boy you can build in 2024, and this video is just that. Now I'm talking specifically about the original style DMG Game Boy. There have been many iterations since, but this one has always been my favorite. I can honestly say that the build I've got here is one of the most satisfying ones I've ever built. A combination of upgrades in this machine gets you the best DMG that you can get your hands on in 2024, in my humble opinion, of course. It's got Funny Playing's DMG Retro Pixel IPS Q5 LCD screen kit, which has got a larger display than the original. It's got a range of options for different color schemes and overlays with pixel grids, as well as being a really crisp and vibrant display. This time, to make the installation of this larger screen as easy and convenient as possible, I used Funny Playing's official replacement shell, which is actually shaped to fit the replacement screen without needing any cutting at all. Thankfully, there's not even any compromise with this, as the quality of the shells is really good. They're nicely molded, well printed, and there's a high quality plastic that gives a really premium finish. I love the shade of blue on this one too. Coupled with Funny Playing's mounting bracket, the new screen fits in place perfectly every time. You're going to need a lens with a bigger aperture, so I went for the glass lens with the white surround, and it looks fantastic. The neon orange buttons contrast perfectly with the blue, and the whole thing's got a really nice premium feel to it. To try and get a better stability with the new display, I also upgraded the power regulator board, which is optional, but so far has resulted in a really stable display with no flickering or fluctuations at all. What's more, it's really easy to build. I'm going to walk you through every step that I took to build this so you can have a go at building one for yourself. So in terms of what you need, of course you are going to need to start off with a working Game Boy. However, in terms of it working, you've basically got to cover the sound. Have you got any sound out of the speaker? Do the headphones work through the headphone socket? And will it switch on and off? Will it also read games? The display doesn't matter so much because we're going to replace that altogether. If you've got no display at all and you want to see if it works, just turn up the volume and put a cartridge in the slot. When it loads up and you can hear the music playing, you will know it is capable of running the games. So what you're actually going to need from your original Game Boy is the rear motherboard. You'll access that by opening up the console. Take off the battery cover, remove any batteries, and you've got 6 tri-wing screws to remove from the rear shell. After that, the two parts will separate, but they are still held together with a ribbon in the middle. You need to carefully just pull down to remove that from the rear motherboard. Pop the front shell to one side. In fact, if you've got all the parts that I get for this build, you won't even need any more of that, and you won't need to take that apart from this point. It's the back shell where you're going to need to get to the parts that you need. Looking inside the back shell, you have the motherboard right in front of you. That is attached with 2 screws in the lower corners, and also there's the headphone socket, which is connected with 2 screws as well. They are all crosshead screws. Undo those and you'll be able to simply lift out the assembly that has the motherboard, the power board, and the headphone board. And with that, you can move all the other bits out of the way because you've got the parts that you need. Now, in terms of this particular motherboard that I had, there were a few slight issues with the battery contact. So although the rest of it was working, I had a quick go over on the 2 main contacts that were attached to the board. The rest are just inside the shell, and I've got some fresh ones in my new shell for those. However, with the positive and negative terminal on there, what I did was I got some distilled vinegar, got that on a cotton bud, and cleaned up the contacts for the positive and negative terminal, making sure that there was no corrosion on the surface. After that, I used a bit of alcohol to clean up any of the vinegar residue, and when I gave it a test later, it worked absolutely fine with the battery. So that was worth doing, and if you've got any issues with slightly dodgy connections with your batteries, that'd be a nice easy fix. So next, let's take a look at all the parts I bought for this awesome upgrade. I got those from Z Labs. I've got an affiliate link in the description for them, and if you want to buy any stuff from there, you will get yourself a nice little discount, and you'll be supporting my channel at the same time. So if you're interested in buying stuff like this, definitely check out that link. Okay, so on my previous Game Boy DMG build, I did encounter a few problems along the way, and one of the biggest issues was trying to trim the shell. It's relatively easy, but it's much easier to buy a pre-trimmed shell. So what I did this time was I bought the official Funny Playing shell in blue. It's pre-cut, the aperture is exactly the right size for the larger screen upgrade that we've got, and it just made the whole job so much easier. There's no cutting required. It comes with good screws, it comes with a dust cover, it comes with pre-installed ground shield and battery contacts. So really it takes a lot of work out of the build for you straight from the off. After being so impressed with it last time, I got myself one of the Robot Retro replacement power regulator boards. It replaces the existing power board, and it's specifically meant for use with IPS screens. To make the process of installing the screen easier still, I bought Funny Playing's official injection molded mounting bracket. It's super precise and it just locates the screen in exactly the right spot every time. Well worth paying for. And of course, there was the screen kit itself. I ordered a white one this time, as I hadn't tried one before, but it's exactly the same as the black one that I had previously. I would say really a white one is best for the clear sort of shells, but in this case, I just wanted to take a look and see what they were like. This is the DMG Retro Pixel IPS Q5 LCD kit. It's an excellent oversized screen. There's a range of color palettes and different grid overlay options that are easy to swap between. I also bought Funny Playing's replacement speaker. It's a modern speaker. It's pre-wired. It sounds much better and louder than the original, and it means that you don't have the hassle of harvesting your old speaker out of your previous Game Boy. I bought the glass lens in white, which has the larger opening specifically for these IPS displays. I got the retro modding neon orange start and select buttons. In hindsight, the one thing I would do differently in terms of what I was buying is, rather than just buy the start and select, is I'd buy a whole silicon set. What I realized later on in the build is that I would have had to open up much more of the Game Boy console to get those out. So if you're doing one of these builds yourself, I would recommend just buying a whole new set of silicon pads to go in your new build. However, if you want to use your original silicon pads, they're pretty straightforward to get out of your original shell. The button set, also by retromodding.com, is the neon orange DMG set. Their button sets are really good because not only do you get the D-pad and the A and B, you also get a replacement power switch and dust cover. So it's quite nice to get that contrasting color, although the Funny Playing shell did come with a matching dust cover. So you've got the option. In this case, I went for the nice contrast with the blue and orange. Okay, so a quick rundown of the parts we are going to need for this build. Of course, you need your original motherboard. We've got the new power board. We've got the shell. We've got the lens. We've got the buttons. We've got the start and select. We've got the speaker. We've got the screen kit, and we've got the screen bracket. What's missing is, of course, those silicon pads that I mentioned before. So whenever I'm building a Game Boy DMG, I always kind of swap the job into two halves. And first of all, I always start with the rear half of the shell. That's where the motherboard goes. That's where your power supply comes from. So it helps with testing any other bits afterwards. So the first job I went for was replacing the original power regulator with the new Robot Retro one. It's got 4 holes. One is marked as red for plus 5 volts. Before you go taking things apart, just have a look at the original board and the new one for the orientation. To remove the wires, I used a soldering iron and a solder sucker. I found it much easier to clamp the board in place to keep it steady. Just heat each point with the soldering iron, suck up the liquid solder, remove it from the sucker, and repeat for the other wires. Then it should simply just pull out from the board. Take the board out of the clamp and put your replacement board in the same way around. Feed the wires into the holes and bend over the tips to stop them falling out. After that, I put flux on just to make sure I got a good joint, but that's not essential. Heat the pad up with your soldering iron for a few seconds, add some solder and give it some time to flow. Repeat that for each hole. I also use snips to trim the ends off the wires, but again, that's not essential. Take that out from the clamp and your old power board is no longer needed. You can pop that to one side with the original parts. At this point, it is worth checking your CPU revision if you haven't already. One quick way of doing that without even taking the Game Boy apart is to remove the battery cover, and if you look in the little window here, it'll tell you the CPU revision. The main reason I check for those is that sometimes I'm doing Game Boy builds that are for use with LSDJ, which is a music making software, and the sound reproduction on the later revisions of the motherboards is much better. If you've got a CPU 1 or CPU 2, it's absolutely fine for playing games, but if you are trying to create your own music, you'll have some issues. In this case, it was a CPU 08, which is quite a late revision and absolutely perfect for creating music. I tend to find anything CPU 04 onwards is absolutely brilliant for making music on the Game Boy. Before putting the board into the shell, put the power button slider in first. That fits behind the motherboard and it's hard to get it in once you've got the motherboard in place. Look on the lower left, there are grooves for the power board. Slot the power board in place and route the wires around the screw post to be able to lower the motherboard in without any pinching. Make sure the switch aligns with the slider and it should be set to off. I decided to use all the new screws that came with the shell, so I laid those out in my tray. Speaking of these trays, I find them really handy and I know people have asked about them before. I'm currently thinking of setting up an Etsy store to sell things like that and maybe things like the 3D printed tool I use for getting hinges out of Game Boy Advance SP and so on. If you think that might be a good idea, let me know in the comments. So when I was laying out the screws in my tray, I noticed that 2 of the crosshead ones were slightly smaller, which I assumed was for the headphone PCB. This is really good, as I've had issues in the past, particularly with third-party shells, with the screws not fitting and the headphone socket being a bit loose. Smaller screws turned out to be a fantastic idea in this case. It held the PCB in place really securely and didn't cause any issues at all with stripping plastic, which is the problem I've had in the past with these sort of shells. So contained in the set, as well as these two smaller ones, is 2 crosshead screws for the rear motherboard, 6 crosshead screws for the front motherboard, and 6 longer tri-wing screws for the final assembly. I screwed the motherboard in first with the 2 screws at the base. Now, because I had the CPU 08 and because I was doing this build for someone who wanted to be making music on their Game Boy, I was doing an internal Pro Sound mod. I've got a whole other video about explaining what Pro Sound mods are, but essentially what I was doing was adding some additional wires to bypass the headphone amplifier, which results in a lower volume signal, but a much cleaner signal with no hiss. So what's commonly referred to as a Pro Sound mod, and it allows you to connect to external sources for recording or performing with a really clean, high quality signal from your Nintendo Game Boy. This mod involves adding 2 additional wires, and to route them safely, they need a passage all the way up towards the volume dial. To do that, I use a round needle file at the corner of the headphone PCB to make a groove big enough to route the 2 wires past. I use 30 AWG, which is very thin, but it's enough to carry the sound signal. Filing it does generate a lot of dust, so I do it away from the main shell. I blew away any excess dust and tidied it up with a soft brush. So for the Pro Sound mod, if you choose to do it, you need to look at the row of 5 solder points near the volume dial. From the top, we've got pre-pot right, pre-pot left, post-pot right, and ground. So pre and post-pot refers to whether the sound signal is before it gets to the pot, the potentiometer, the volume dial, or after. So post-pot means it is after the volume dial, which means you can control the volume levels with the dial there. Alternatively, you just get a consistent line level signal out and you can control that on a mixer or something like that. For a bit more versatility, I always found post-pot is much better because you can still use headphones. Yes, it's not as loud as it was before, but you do get a nice clean signal. So in this case, I was using the 3rd point down for the left signal, the 4th point down for the right signal. I cut a red and a blue wire to a suitable length to reach from the volume wheel to the headphone board. I checked with the diagram I've always used just to double check. You need to connect the left and the right to 2 specific points on the headphone board, and you need to remove the 2 leftmost black wires that attach the headphone board to the motherboard. Cut the wires off with a pair of snips, and then you can use the 2 smaller crosshead screws to attach the headphone PCB into the shell. I made sure that the remaining black and white wires were routed correctly. If you want to get a really clean joint for this Pro Sound mod, it's best to remove and replace the old solder on the motherboard and put some fresh on. I heated it with a soldering iron, removed it with the solder sucker as before. Of those bigger blobs, you need the leftmost and middle ones as shown. I put a bit of flux on and then added some fresh solder by heating the area and added the solder until a sufficient amount of it was in place. I stripped the end of the wires, heated the middle blob, inserted the red wire and held it in place until it cooled. I repeated the same with the blue wire in the other blob of solder. I checked the routing of the wires and cut them to length. It's best to have them a little bit too long and just route them along the way, rather than make them too short and have to take them off and start again. I stripped and prepared the other ends. I popped them in crocodile clips, put a bit of flux on and melted a little bit of solder on them just to make a bit more solid. It strengthens the tip and gives you a better joint when you are soldering them in place. I heated the 2 points on the motherboard and added a little bit of fresh solder. I snipped the end off the wire so there's just about 1 millimeter of exposed wire showing. You don't want any bare wire after you've finished soldering. So on the contact for the right signal, I held the red wire in position at the desired angle, heated the blob, inserted the wire and held it in place till it cooled. I repeated for the blue wire on the left contact. After this, you need to route the wires to avoid any pressure points or screw holes, particularly at the corner of the headphone board. I secured it in place with a little bit of tape to make sure that the wires didn't move about when I was reassembling. I used Kapton tape, but any sort of tape should be fine. So at this point, of course, I needed to test that the Pro Sound mod had worked. I plugged some stereo headphones into the audio socket and put 4 batteries in the compartment. You don't actually need to attach the front motherboard to test this. You can do everything with the rear board. I put the headphones in, switched on, and you need to hear that boot sound in your left and your right channels. And in this case, it worked absolutely fine. So the first thing I did was attach the new speaker to the new front motherboard that comes with the screen kit. I took the main PCB, put it in a clamp. I checked the orientation of the wiring for the speaker on my original board, but really it doesn't matter. You can have those wires either way around. The main reason I checked and looked at the original was so I could actually route the wires the right way without ending up with any pinching. So I simply applied flux to the holes on the motherboard and just melted a blob of solder straight onto each bit. I then reheated each blob, pushed the wire in place and held it in place while it was cooling, and that's your speaker in place, nice and and simple. So it's wise at this point to test your new screen kit for any potential issues before putting the whole assembly together. The kit comes with a large black ribbon cable. This slots into the new front PCB. It does need a little bit of force and a bit of a wiggle, but make sure it's lined up correctly and be gentle. Take your time. You don't want to damage that ribbon. To attach the other end is a bit fiddly, but it's easier with all the parts on their side. Be careful when you're aligning it, and it should slot in fairly easily. Position it as I've done here, face down, but with the front PCB higher up so you can get to the ribbon slot at the top. Unclip the two clamps by sliding them to the top of the board, insert the screen ribbon, pinch the clamp shut, and switch your console on. I still had batteries in from when I was doing testing earlier, but if you haven't, obviously you're going to need batteries in to do the testing of the screen. In this case, everything was working fine, so I could switch off and disassemble and get on with assembling that front half. I took the large ribbon out of the rear board, but left it in the front. In hindsight, it's easier to just remove it from both and pop it back in later, or take it out of the front shell and leave it attached to the rear motherboard, because it'll just get in the way, but it's not a huge problem. At this point, I put down a soft cloth to avoid any scratches to the shell or the screen whenever I'm placing the unit face down. It's quite a good tip to raise the lower end and pop a screwdriver or something underneath to allow all the buttons to locate easily. So at this point, I realized I had no silicone membranes for my D-pad and my A and B buttons. If you were sensible enough to order some, then you can just pop those in on top of your buttons. Otherwise, you can get them out of your original console, or if you're a hoarder like me and you've got a whole load of them available, I picked two out of my collection and gave them a quick clean up. If they need cleaning, just gently rub them with your fingers. This tends to do the job nicely with no mess. So there's some small pins on the shell and there's some holes in the membranes to help you align them correctly. Put them in with the black pads facing towards you. So now it's time to prepare the screen with the alignment bracket if you bought it. I would totally recommend buying this. You don't need to bother with any adhesives. Everything lines up correctly and it's perfect every time. What's more is it clips in place into the bracket, which means that nothing's going to fall out as you're lowering it into the shell. Just make sure it's fully in place and that the ribbon goes through the opening at the back. Before you put it in place, you're going to have to peel off the protective film. Then you just lower it in face down and it locates around the screw posts. These newer kits come with a surface mounted power LED on the motherboard and a plastic diffuser. Remember to pop the diffuser in the LED opening on the shell before moving forward. Undo the two clips at the top of the PCB and put the screen ribbon in place. Clamp it shut very carefully and then position the speaker in place at the bottom, followed by the motherboard. It wasn't quite fitting right for me, so I lifted it out, checked the silicone membranes were in place and the screen housing was pushed all the way down, then put the motherboard in place. For screwing it in place, I got the ribbon out of the way. As I said, it's best left on the rear PCB after testing or just removing altogether. Now you only need to put screws in the lower areas around the buttons. There are 6 of them. I find it easier to start them face down and then lift it sideways to screw them all the way in. Be careful not to touch the exposed screen. If you're worried about it, you can put that film back on the screen if you like. With all the screws in place, note the little tab at the top on the ribbon. I've not really investigated, but there's a self-adhesive tab, so I peeled it and stuck it in place using tweezers to help. It's something to do with touch control, but bearing in mind that there's a solder pad there as well, I assume that needs to be soldered to something on the motherboard. I'm not entirely sure what, but to be honest, the controls on the replacement for the contrast dial do the job absolutely fine. So in this case, I didn't do any additional soldering. After this, I took time to route the wires on the speaker with tweezers to make sure there wasn't going to be any pinching when we were reassembling. I reinserted the large ribbon on the front and then the rear PCBs as before, and then carefully aligned the two halves of the shell. Make sure everything fits together neatly without you having to apply any excess pressure. To screw it together, place it face down, being very careful of that exposed screen. Remove the left and rightmost batteries and carefully put 6 tri-wing screws in place. These are new screws, they are quite long screws, and you might need to cut a new thread. To tap a thread, you simply screw in about a half turn, unscrew a quarter turn, screw in half turn, out a quarter turn, like a wiggling motion, and that will cut a really neat solid thread without any plastic stripping. Don't over tighten them and you'll get a nice secure fit between the front and back shell. Again, it works best to hold the console on its side to put the screws in securely. Reinsert the batteries, put the battery cover on and switch it on. Check the screen for any specks of dust that might need removing. A little bit of washi tape or masking tape is good for lifting those specks off, but luckily in this case I had no issues at all. With the console switched on, peel the backing off the screen screen lens, including the central window, and lower it in place. Take your time and be careful. It is really fiddly. And if you try and use anything sharper to help with the peeling, you run the risk of scratching the paint on the back of the lens, which will look awful. So you can either use a fingernail or a plastic spudger to try and lift away the self-adhesive layer and just peel off that backing. Now you need to make sure everything is removed before lowering it in place. It wouldn't be a Joe Bleeps build without a stupid mistake, would it? I was so worried about scratching the paint on the back of the lens that I hadn't noticed I'd left the little backing for the square of the aperture on the lens, and I just, like you can spot in the video where I just lowered it in place, you can see the moment where I realized I'd left it on. I thought I was gonna have to take the whole thing apart, but fortunately a strategically placed sucker in the upper right hand corner of the screen and some very careful painstaking lifting. I didn't want to force or twist anything. I have cracked these glass screen lenses in the past, so I didn't want that to happen. Fortunately it allowed me to lift the screen lens away. At that point I could remove the backing from the central aperture, lower it in place carefully again, and thankfully that was the only issue I faced on this build, and it was an easy fix. But what's even easier is making sure you've actually peeled the stuff off in the first place. Never mind, we live and learn. So once you've got it in position and you are sure it's correct, you can use a soft cloth to smooth down around the border of the screen to make sure you've got some good adhesion and no dust is going to get inside near that screen. It's a really good fit. The lens fitted perfectly in the shell with no gaps around the edge. So the dial on the left where the contrast dial used to be is a little sort of adjustable button that you can scroll down and up, and you can also push in. So you can push it up and down to change the brightness of the screen, and then if you push it in once, the up and down will cycle through different color schemes, and if you press and hold and wait for a bit, it'll swap to a different display. Instead of the clear screen that you normally get, you get a retro pixel grid overlay that is a bit more similar to the original display on the Game Boy. Everything looked absolutely great. I've got a test cartridge, so I went through all the tests and the display and sound were all perfect. It all worked a treat and it looks fantastic. I love how this Game Boy turned out. Now, despite all the mods in here, you might have noticed that I didn't go for the USB-C rechargeable battery route. There's two reasons for that. So first of all, practicality. I'm quite happy using IKEA's ladder rechargeable batteries. I think they're fantastic, and it means I can recharge one set and have another set in my Game Boy at any given point in time. In terms of using the USB-C charging and the rechargeable lithium polymer batteries and things, I just worry a little bit about some of the dangers associated with that and the potential risks of battery explosions and things like that get me all worried, so I just stick with what I know. My main reason though for sticking with the original AA batteries is the weighting. I think that for this, handling it with the AA batteries in, it's just perfectly balanced. It doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel authentic when it's a little bit more lightweight. It's the original DMG brick, isn't it? It needs that heft, and I like having that extra weight in the lower half in terms of the comfort of playing. So I'm not swapping over to USB-C anytime soon, and if I did, I think I'd have to put some little metal weights in the battery compartment just to balance things out. If you think I'm being overly cautious in terms of doing the rechargeable battery mods, let me know in the comments. You know I'm always open to trying something new, so if you can guide me in the right direction, I might give it a try at some point. So if you want to try something like this, all you need is a Game Boy that will power on, that has sound working, and will load games. For all the other stuff, get yourself onto Z Labs using the link I mentioned in the description. It's a discounted link, and you'll be supporting my channel with anything that you buy. So I was delighted. This build went really smoothly. It turned out awesome, and barely anything went wrong, aside from that issue with the screen lens that we won't talk about right now. But that is not always the case. On my previous DMG build, I encountered quite a few challenges along the way. There was a lot of problem solving involved and a few slightly scary moments. If you've not seen that video, you definitely want to check that out. If you've made it all the way to the end of this one, trust me, you are going to love it. Like, subscribe, leave a comment, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.